Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the RetroBreak Podcast. I'm really glad that everyone enjoyed the first episode. It did way better than I could have ever hoped for, so thank you so much for all your support, and I'm really excited to get started with really doing proper in-depth weekly episodes. In this first episode, I'm going to be talking about things I wish I didn't know about retro gaming. Things that I kind of found out as I was going along my journey of playing and collecting retro games that have in some ways kind of ruined the experience while also at the same time improving it and taking it to that next level. It's a really deep topic and there's a lot that I want to cover. I might actually end up splitting this up into 2 different episodes. And as you're listening along, if you actually think of anything that you agree or disagree with, if you click the link in the description or if you're on Spotify, then it should be somewhere on the page, but you can actually submit a video response. So if you want to ask me a question or if you want to have some sort of input on what I'm talking about during the podcast, definitely check that out. I'd be really interested to see how it works. So without further ado, here's a lot of things. I was about to say a number there, but I don't actually know how many things I've got written down. Here are a lot of things that I wish I didn't know about retro gaming. And I'm actually going to be talking through these in the order that I found them out, or at least I'm going to try and do it that way. So the first thing, and if you're from the UK, you will definitely feel this one, that is the first time I found out about the difference between 50 and 60 hertz for games. And when I found that out, I honestly felt like my childhood was a lie. I felt like the companies had been deceiving us for years. Honestly, it was such a horrible feeling, but at the same time, such an eye-opening experience, and it really explained a lot. So, for those of you that don't know, 50 and 60 hertz, in America, they actually had 60 hertz as standard, and the same in Japan as well. But here in the UK, we actually had 50 hertz due to a combination of our TV technology at the time, the way the CRTs ran here in the UK using the PAL system instead of NTSC, and it was also to do with the different power voltage that the UK has compared to other regions, and there's a lot of different ones, and I would love to cover that in a future episode of the podcast as well. In simple terms, it's the speed that the game actually ran at the time, so I believe that the games here in the UK, the ones for PAL systems that weren't optimized, actually ran about 16% slower than their American and Japanese counterparts. And obviously, as I was growing up, I had no idea that this was even a thing. So I was playing games like Mega Man 1 and 2, loads of really cool games for the NES and the SNES, and the Mega Drive, even Sonic 1, that is a brilliant example of this. So Sonic 1 on the Mega Drive, for me, was a regular slow platformer, kind of like the Mario series. But over in America, they were all talking about blast processing and how crazy fast Sonic is, and Mario would never be able to keep up. But over here in the UK, it was a completely different story. It wasn't actually until Sonic 2 that Sega actually kind of reprogrammed the game to make it run properly on UK systems as well as American systems. There were, of course, a few games that were PAL optimized, and these ones didn't have that problem. And some, believe it or not, were actually optimized too much and actually ran faster for us than they did in America. So whenever I go back and play Super Mario 1 now, that's one of the games that was actually overcompensated for the UK release, and it actually runs faster than the American and Japanese counterparts. So whenever I hear the soundtrack for Mario 1, I always think it's running too slow. But whenever I hear the soundtrack for things like Sonic 1 or the original 2 Mega Man games, I always think that it's running way too fast. So the first thing that I wish I didn't know, at the time at least, was the difference between 50 and 60 hertz. And surprisingly, this wasn't just a problem in the 90s. Even as far as the mid-2000s with the Wii and the Virtual Console, Nintendo, for whatever crazy idea they had in their mind that they thought this was a good idea, it really, really wasn't. They actually released the games on the PAL Virtual Console in 50 hertz. So unfortunately, we ended up with those inferior versions for a lot longer than we should have. And it's only recently that I've kind of gone back and modded all of my different consoles, which is something I'll get to a little bit later on in the podcast. But yeah, the difference between 50 and 60 hertz was a really big one for me at the time when I found that out. Now, the next thing I learned as a kid, and something that still bugs me to this day when people get it wrong, or when I know there's a better solution out there, and that is cable types and how they actually display a different picture on the TV. So, back in the day, you would get a console like the NES or the Master System, and it would come with an RF adapter, and you would basically plug this into the back of the TV, and then you'd have to tune the TV, kind of like how you'd tune an indoor TV aerial. So, the picture quality, of course, as it was all coming through one small cable, cable was extremely fuzzy, but at the time I knew no different. That was how I played the NES, that was how I played the Master System back in the day. I had no problem with it until I found out something called SCART, which is surprisingly something that the UK actually did better than America, because in America, they didn't really have RGB SCART that much, but here in the UK, it was something you could get quite easily, and quite a lot of our TVs actually supported it. And the difference between using an RF cable and an RGB SCART cable is just mind-blowing. It's almost like putting on glasses if you need glasses. It's like a completely different experience. And as soon as I found that out, of course, I had to go and get SCART cables for every system that I had. And I remember actually the first time I got the Wii, it actually came with the composite cables, the red, green and blue ones. And that is really bad. So the first thing I actually did when I got the Wii was look up whether you could get an RGB SCART cable. And I went out and got that pretty soon after launch. And I remember paying almost as much as a brand new game, and people thought I was crazy at the time. But even way back then, I've always wanted the best picture quality that I can get out of the system, and for a long time, up until the release of late gen CRTs or early LCDs, the best you could get was RGB SCART or S-Video if you're in America. That's kind of the closest counterpart, but I still think SCART is slightly better, and I actually still use it today over there. I've got some CRTs and I always use RGB wherever I can, and I've actually got a few modded consoles as well. Like I said earlier, I'll get back to that in just a little bit, but I just wanted to bring this up now to kind of give you guys an idea of just how much different cable types really mean to me, and they can really enhance the experience as well. But whenever I see someone using the cable that came with the system rather than one of these better ones that you could buy after, I'm always just sort of wishing in my head that they would go out and get better cables and fix the picture issues that they've got, because it really does drive me crazy. And another thing that never used to bother me whatsoever, I didn't even know this was a thing really until sort of the Xbox 360 and PS3 era, and that is frame rate. And this is a big deal for a lot of people, obviously, but back in the day, I played games, and bear in mind that the games here ran slower anyway, so if you think the frame rate was bad in America, you actually have to take off an extra 16% for us here in the UK. So one of my favourite games of all time is Ocarina of Time for the N64. Of course, an absolute masterpiece. At the time, no one really cared about the frame rate, or at least no one that I knew cared about the frame rate, and obviously reviewers and stuff at the time, they gave it really high praise. But here in the UK, can you believe this, actually ran at about 17 or 18 frames a second, and if you were to play a game like that today, you would think something was wrong with it, or you just refused to play it outright because it wasn't 30 or 60 frames a second. But back then, a lot of these N64 games and PS1 and stuff at the time actually had this problem where they could barely get into the 20s in the frame rates, let alone 60, or like I've got this screen over here that does 144 frames a second. That was just unthinkable at the time. So what I'm trying to say is that I never even noticed there was an issue with frame rate. I played all the way through Ocarina of Time. I've played it many times since and it still doesn't really bother me. But the first time that I actually found out what frame rate was actually at a boot sale. And I was actually selling some N64 games, and that is a really sad story that I'm going to come back to in a future episode of the podcast. But one of the games that I was selling was Banjo-Tooie, complete in box. And someone came up to me, they wanted to buy a bunch of my N64 games, and they said, "Oh, it's such a shame that Banjo-Tooie runs so slowly. Don't you just hate the fact that the game's so choppy?" And I was like, I really don't know what you mean. What do you mean it's choppy? It seems perfectly fine to me. But going back and playing it today and comparing it to the version that's out for the Xbox One and the Xbox 360 that came out on Rare Replay, going back and playing the original, you can really, really notice that the frame rate doesn't really get out of the 20s for the entire game. But back then, it was never an issue. So that's something that kind of frustrates me now that I would never have even had a clue about before. So that's another thing that's really frustrating to know, really. And now going back to the topic of TVs, which is one of my favourite topics, and I would love to do more future episodes on this, that is the different TV types and how they actually affect not just the picture quality, but the actual gameplay itself. So back in the day, I kind of noticed this early on actually when I went from using a really nice widescreen CRT that I had to my first flat screen when we moved into the new house. It was around 2005, I think, at the time, and as soon as I plugged in my original SNES, N64, PlayStation 1 into this flat screen, I immediately noticed that something was off. I always thought And up until that point, it was true. I always thought that as TV technology improved, the picture quality was bound to improve with it, right? Well, that wasn't really the case, at least for games and consoles that were made for an earlier generation of TVs, because the way that CRTs work and the way that LCDs work is completely different technology, and at the time I didn't really understand, so I kind of put up with it for a long, long time. But the difference between a CRT and an LCD, the most important thing is resolution, and the fact that the CRT can have a max resolution of about 480i on a regular consumer CRT at least, and a regular HD LCD at the time was either 720 or 1080p. I didn't really understand why it looked so bad at the time, but looking back now and understanding more about the technology, the way it stretches the pixels to fill the screen really isn't ideal. And it's kind of something that I wish I didn't notice, because I'm sure there's a lot of people watching this, listening to this. I'm sure you know a lot of people that plug in these old consoles into modern TVs and don't even realise anything's wrong. But for me, realising that I could have such a better experience on an older system, on an older TV set, was just such a confusing concept to me. And since then, since I realised that you can actually get better picture quality using an LCD, that got me down a really, really deep and dark and dangerous rabbit hole of buying loads of different upscalers, scan converters, HDMI adapters. You can see where this is going. I got completely obsessed with trying to get the best picture quality in between the days of having a CRT, having an LCD, and now today I've kind of given up on the whole thing and gone right back to using CRTs again, because in my personal opinion, there's still no better way than playing retro games than playing it on a CRT. Even if you have something like the OSSC or the RetroTink or a Mister, I still prefer the original experience of playing it on the CRT. And these upscalers and mods and stuff, they weren't cheap either. Like the OSSC is about 200 quid, and basically you're paying to try and get the experience that you would have had in the past. There's lots of really talented developers that are making these systems, and they do look absolutely incredible, and they reduce the input lag down to the milliseconds. It's really impressive stuff, but it's all trying to solve a problem that if you're not deep into this retro gaming rabbit hole like I am, you probably wouldn't even know that this problem exists. So when you find out that these options are out there, it really does make it very, very difficult to go back to just using an original system with the wires that it came with on whatever TV screen you've got available. So in some ways, I'm really glad that I know about this stuff, and I've got the curiosity and the interest to get all of these different systems and to try them all out, and obviously even to make videos on some of them. I really do love the technology, but at the same time, I wish I didn't know about it, because I could just enjoy the games without having to worry that maybe this pixel's a little bit too stretched, or maybe these colours aren't blending properly together. You can see where this is going. It's a dangerous path. So if you're listening to this, if you're just into retro gaming casually, just try and enjoy it for what it is. Don't try and aim for the perfection, for the perfect kind of input, output. And another thing that's kind of frustrating, and since I found out about them, I've not been able to go back either, and that is something called scan lines. I'm sure a lot of you know, but scan lines are basically what the CRT produced on a 240p image, which is about half the resolution of the full screen. Basically, what it would do for the earlier systems to fill the screen is to actually skip out each alternating line going down the screen, and you would kind of have a little black bar that fills in the gaps. And this gave it a really nice clear image on a CRT, but basically a lot of modern LCDs don't really understand the concept of 240p, which is what a lot of older consoles ran at. So what they actually do first is to get that original small little square of a 240p image and then stretch it out to fill a 480i image, which is sort of the lowest standard definition resolution that they can support. And then they get that already stretched and broken image to fill out a 1080p or 4K display. So that kind of gives you an idea as to why the picture quality looks so bad, and some of the upscalers actually try and alleviate this problem by keeping the 240p image intact. And one of the ways that they can do that is with artificial scan lines, and they do look absolutely incredible, but once you've seen them in action and once you've got them dialed in perfectly, it's almost impossible to go back to a system, an older system at least, that doesn't have scan lines if you're playing it on a flat screen. I love the fact that a lot of modern remakes of games and re-releases actually have scanline options, and usually they do look pretty nice. It was something that I was unsure about for a long time, but over time I've really grown to love scanlines, especially with the kind of things that you can do with the OSSC and what you can do with the Mister as well. There's some people that have really, really fine-tuned them to the point where you can actually recreate the pixel grid layout of original CRT displays, and there's loads of different settings that you can tinker with as well. But the whole thing that I'm trying to get at with this podcast is all of this tinkering, all of these different devices that you have to connect, just to be able to enjoy games the way that you would have without knowing any of this in the past. It all kind of builds up this kind of barrier for me personally to be able to go back and experience these if I don't have these either modern improvements that try and recreate the past or an original CRT to play them on. I just thought of another thing that really bugs me as well, and this is about emulators. So obviously back in the day, emulators were fine. They were a great way of enjoying games that you wouldn't have been able to buy or play normally. But there's one thing that I found out about in the past few years, which really is difficult to go back to, and I can spot it almost immediately. I even spotted this on the Nintendo trailer for when they first showed off their Game & Watch, and this is something called integer scaling. And trust me, when you find out what this is, it will be impossible not to notice it and not to be able to try and turn it on at every opportunity possible. Basically, what integer scaling is, it's kind of either doubling or tripling the actual original pixel. So 1 pixel becomes 4 in a little square that becomes 8 in a slightly bigger square, depending on your screen resolution. And if they're actually scaled up in integers, so like 2, 4, 8, 16, etc., then you will still retain the right shape and size of the individual pixels. And that means that when the screen scrolls from one side to the other, you won't get any sort of weird shimmer or artifacts or anything like that. But when Nintendo showed off their Game & Watch, the Mario one in particular, I instantly noticed that the scaling was off on it. And they've actually fixed that on the Zelda one by actually introducing an option to turn on the correct aspect ratio. So that is something that I kind of wish I didn't know about, because it's ruined a lot of games, and it's actually ruined a lot of game collections that came out on modern systems that don't have this implemented properly. It is really difficult to go back to. And there's so many more little things like this that have built up over time, which is kind of really, really interesting in one sense, but also really, really scary in another sense. So I asked on Twitter and Discord what some of your things were that you found out that makes it really difficult to go back, and I had some fantastic responses. So someone told me that they can't play on an original Game Boy anymore after experiencing the games on a Super Game Boy. And I can definitely see where he's coming from with that. I used to love playing my Game Boy games on the SNES back in the day, and whenever I would put them back into the original brick Game Boy with the screen that you could barely see, it was always such a hassle, and I couldn't wait until I got back home and I was able to actually play them on the big screen. Someone else had a really interesting answer, which has actually got me thinking about a future episode as well, and that is that they preferred playing games when they really focused on just one game, rather than sampling many, many different games for like 10 or 20 minutes each. You really got a lot more enjoyment out of sitting down with one retro game on its own, which is something that's kind of impossible to do these games, especially if you're a game collector like I am. But back in the day, obviously, I would just have one game to really focus on for probably a month at a time, and I really got so much more enjoyment out of it than I do any games today, where I'm always darting between 4 and 5, so I can definitely see where he's coming from with that. Now here's a really good response from Joel J over on my Discord server. He's actually mentioned 2 things that have really improved gaming, but at the same time made it really difficult. They are FPGA, which is a fantastic answer and something that I wish I'd thought of actually. So compared to emulation, once you actually play a game using FPGA technology, you'll immediately notice how much more responsive, how much more accurate it is compared to a lot of emulators that you're probably used to, and it will make it really difficult to go back. So that was a brilliant one. And the second one was something that I've noticed very recently that I really care about, and that is a Game Boy Pixel Grid. And I'm going to use the Analog Pocket as an example here, because that has by far the best kind of screen filter that I've ever seen, especially for the Game Boy Color games. Not only does the grid recreate the original Game Boy Color screen properly, but it actually also recreates the sub-pixels, which make the really specific colors that the Game Boy Color could actually make. And when you look really closely on the Analog Pocket, you can see just how much care and attention went into making it as close as it could possibly be, whilst also improving it in a lot of really significant ways. And that is going to make it really difficult, not just to go back to the Game Boy Color, not just to go back to even my modded Game Boy Advance, but to go back to anything, even really high quality emulation or even FPGA. The way they did the sub-pixels on the screen on this is honestly, it's mind-blowing. And I wish that was something I'd covered in my review of the system. It's something that I really started to appreciate after I'd done my review and after I'd actually started playing it quite a bit more. And I would love to talk more about the Analog Pocket on the podcast at some point as well. So let me know if you'd like to hear more about my thoughts on that. And the final community response here, and another really good one. This one is from Said No Juan Ever over on my Discord server, and he said that backwards compatibility. So being able to play things like PS1 games on the PS3, and then the effort of dragging the PS1 out of the closet and hooking it all up just to get a kind of worse experience, in all honesty, it really wasn't worth the effort, and I can definitely agree with that point as well. And it's something that I wish a lot more consoles did. I know that the PS5 and the Xbox Series S and X are doing really well with backwards compatibility, but obviously Nintendo's kind of dropped the ball in recent years, so it'd be great to see more of that in the future, with meaningful upgrades at the same time as well. I loved what they did with the GBA, being able to play original Game Boy games on it and stuff, and obviously with the DS and 3DS, and it does make it kind of difficult to go back to the previous generation once you've appreciated all of the benefits that the next generation gives you, as well as being able to play all your old games with these improvements as well. So thank you so much for answering this question. They were some fantastic responses. I would also love for you guys to let me know what some of your things are that you found out about retro gaming that makes it really difficult to go back to these days. That would be really interesting. So like I said at the start, if you check the link, there should be a video responses option, and I would love to hear from some of you. I really hope this was an interesting topic for you. I've got so many more topics planned. I actually came up with about another 5 earlier while I was in the shower, so I've wrote all them down as well. Thank you to everyone who's in the YouTube premiere. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this episode. I really enjoyed making it. I've had such a bad day today. I'm still in the process of moving house. It is such a slow and painful process, and I've been on the phone to solicitors and stuff all day, and it was driving me mad. So I was really excited to actually come here and film this and just forget about the world for a minute and just enjoy talking about retro games. Of course, follow, subscribe, whatever you need to do to get this in your ears every week or every few days. I haven't really decided yet. Anyway, that's it for this episode. Really hope you enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to talking to you all again soon. Goodbye.